Today, we continue with this story of Jesus, this story of Jesus going from place to place and teaching with an authority that is surprising to people. It's an authority that puts him in this kind of growing conflict. And it's in this context of healing. This conflict comes up because Jesus is going out and healing people, which I think for many of us seems a little bit strange. Why would people be shocked at someone healing? Why would people be upset at Jesus healing? And I think a part of that is because we don't understand this connection between sickness and being unclean. We hear this throughout this set of stories. A demon speaks up, an unclean spirit, the text says. Jesus goes around, and simultaneous with his healing of bodily sickness is this casting out of demons. A leper comes to him who is sick and unclean. A woman lays in bed with a fever. She is sick and unclean. This isn't a connection that we particularly understand. We think of sickness as catching a cold, having the flu, maybe something more severe, even COVID. But generally, we don't think of ourselves, at least in our heads, we don't think of ourselves as unclean because we're sick. But sit for a moment and reflect on those times when you have had a long-term illness. Our bodies, they do kind of terrible things when we're ill. They don't smell very good. We have to make quick trips to the bathroom that are awkward. Maybe our skin doesn't look very great. Maybe we break out. And often we have a sense of shame around those things, right? We don't talk about going to the bathroom. I can't tell you the shock that I felt in my body when I was in the Philippines and we're sitting around a meal with rice and mangoes, and we're having a conversation about how the four of us, visitors to the Philippines from the United States, are feeling about living in a slum in the Philippines for the summer. And someone just straight out asks, well, how's your body? How's your intestines? Have you been going to the bathroom regularly? And I just thought, I'm eating food. We don't talk about using the bathroom while we're eating food. But in the Philippines, they were particularly aware of how the viruses and the bacteria that they have affect American systems. And they wanted to make sure we were eating the right combination of rice and mangoes. And I will leave it to your imagination to know what rice and mangoes do and how eating them in appropriate combination leave you in balance. But for them, it was completely normal to have this conversation. It was completely normal to talk about bodies. And they did it out of a concern for us. And yet all of us had this moment of shame and awkwardness of like, we don't talk about these things. Because in our culture, we don't really talk about how we feel when our bodies fail and the kind of embarrassment we feel that things don't work quite in the way that they ought to be able to work. The embarrassment we feel when we have rashes, when we have eczema, when we have to go to the bathroom more frequently than normal. We wonder if people notice. And so very often we isolate ourselves a little bit, right? I'm not feeling well. And maybe what we say to people is, I don't want you to catch it. And that's a good reason. It's good to not spread things. But sometimes we isolate ourselves because we feel embarrassed. We feel like we just don't want people to know. We don't want people to have to put up with our bodies and the weird things that they're doing. We don't want people to know that we're running back and forth to the bathroom or the bed. We don't want people to know that we're just exhausted all the time. That embarrassment, that shame, that is our kind of cultural remnant of feeling unclean. In the ancient world, to have a long-term illness like leprosy, a fever that puts you in a bed, any kind of skin disease, to be a person who struggles with mental issues, to be in that situation for a long time, what it does is it puts you outside of community. It puts you away from your friends. That's what uncleanness means. To be unclean in the ancient Jewish context is to not be able to be around your friends and your family. You actually shouldn't be in the synagogue. It's pretty striking that there's an unclean spirit in the synagogue. Mark, by telling us this story, is telling us that there are lines that are being crossed that shouldn't be crossed. You shouldn't have an unclean spirit in a place of prayer and worship, and yet there is. And yet, on the outside are these people who are sick, who have skin diseases, who have fevers, and who can't come to the synagogue because they are unclean. And the only people in this culture who are allowed to welcome back the unclean, who are allowed to say, "You have been healed," are the priests. If you have suffered a long-term illness in the ancient world, as a Jew, when you were healed, you had to go back to the priest to have that healing confirmed so that the priest could publicly say to everyone, this person is welcome back. This person and their sickness, and perhaps the sins that caused the sickness in the ancient world, there is this relationship between sin and sickness. These sins have been forgiven. This person can come back. Being a priest was essential to maintaining the social order around, to maintaining relationships between families. It was the religious church, the synagogues, the temple that allowed people to come back to their homes, that confirmed that this person indeed was well. And I don't want to mock that role. I think that role is actually really important, because in a world where uncleanness can cast you out, somebody needs to have the authority to say, no, this person is welcome back. This person is welcome in our midst. It does not matter anymore what they struggled with. They are welcome to come back. The conflict in this set of stories, though, is who has the authority to do that? Does Jesus have that authority? Does this itinerant preacher who has taken on the mantle of the prophet John the Baptist, who took on the mantle of Elijah, does this itinerant preacher have the authority to grant healing to people, to say, you are welcome back in our midst? That is what surprises people. His claim to say, you are welcome. I think that struggle is a struggle that we have all the time. We like to say that we are a welcoming church, right? The Episcopal Church welcomes you. Those faded signs still show up on corners all around cities and towns throughout the world. It's actually how we found the small Episcopal church in Bandon, as I saw the sign. The Episcopal Church welcomes you. But we struggle with the kind of people we welcome and how much we welcome them. We struggle to welcome people who have different ideas and opinions than we do. We struggle to welcome people who want to do church a little bit differently, or who might not be comfortable with what we're doing or the way that we're doing it. This community at St. Philip's has struggled to feel welcome in the larger Episcopal Church because it comes from a different culture than the white American church around it. Being a Black, Caribbean, descended American Episcopal Church is a different thing. We all know what it is to be on both sides of the welcoming and the unwelcoming, of the creating of community and struggling with making sure that community works for us. And sometimes the way we do that is we just make sure other people aren't really a part of that community. We don't talk to them as much. We don't welcome them in quite the same way. And yet, Jesus calls all of us to be followers of him, followers of one whose ministry, the first things that he does having taken on this prophetic mantle, is to go and welcome people, to heal them, to acknowledge their situation of uncleanliness, of sickness, of struggle, and to offer them healing and welcome them back into community, welcome them back into their families. That is our call. That is who we are fundamentally called as all of us as disciples, as followers of Jesus, to follow the one who welcomes all back into community. Amen.
Amen.